My name is Roy. I am 72 years old, and 3 days ago I sat at a gleaming walnut dining table while my own flesh and blood leaned across the fine china and spit directly into my face. He told me I was a useless freeloader, a pathetic burden taking up space in his beautiful home. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply took a linen napkin, wiped my wrinkled cheek, stood up, and walked out into the freezing rain. Within 48 hours, I legally sold that beautiful house right out from under him, stripped away every single penny I ever gave him, and completely erased myself from his life. To grasp the full poetic justice of what I pulled off, you need to understand the misery that had become my everyday existence. It was a Friday evening, and the sprawling suburban estate in Alpharetta, Georgia, hummed with the sounds of clinking crystal and self-congratulatory laughter. My son Brennan and his wife Serena were throwing a lavish dinner party for her parents. I wasn't welcomed as a guest under that roof. I was treated like a ghost when it suited them and hired help when they needed something done. Welcome back to Honor Revenge Stories. I'm glad you're here. If this is your first time, consider hitting that subscribe button so the next story finds its way to you. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments, are you driving, cooking, resting, maybe just winding down after a long day? I always love knowing who's on the other end of this. One quick note, some details in this story have been shaped for the telling, and any resemblance to specific individuals is purely coincidental. What matters most is the truth at the heart of it. Serena had insisted I wear a black suit and keep out of the way, unless I was clearing plates or topping off glasses. Her parents held court at the head of the table, loudly cataloging their golf club memberships and European vacations, shooting glances of barely concealed pity my way every time I drew near. Brennan sat there drinking it all and chest swelled like a lord surveying his domain. I was simply the old man, quartered in the attached suite, the embarrassment the household had to absorb. Dinner had been a punishing ordeal. My knees ached and my age-spotted hands carried a faint tremor I worked hard to keep in check. Serena snapped her fingers at me, jabbing toward her father's empty wine glass. It was an expensive bottle of Bordeaux, one Brennan had boasted cost $250. I lifted the bottle, moved behind Serena's father, and started to pour. Then my grip gave way. Just a fraction of an inch, a brief seize of worn-out muscles, but that was all it took. 3 drops of dark red wine bloomed across the crisp white tablecloth. The room went silent in an instant, the quiet pressing down like something physical. Serena gasped with theatrical horror, her hand flying to her mouth, as though I'd committed an act of violence. Brennan slowly pushed his chair back, his face flushed moments ago, with wine and easy laughter shifting toward a dangerous crimson. He rose to his full height over me, the veins in his neck standing out. He wrenched the bottle from my hand and slammed it down hard enough to rattle every piece of silverware on the table. Then he leaned in close. I could smell the liquor on his breath. Without a syllable of warning, he spat directly into my face. The warm, degrading wet hit my cheek and tracked slowly toward my jaw. I stood there motionless, the humiliation burning hotter than any fire I'd ever known. Serena's parents looked elsewhere, suddenly absorbed in whatever was on their plates, making no move to intervene. Brennan sneered down at me, his voice soaked in contempt. He called me a clumsy, useless freeloader. He told me I was nothing but a parasite bleeding the life out of his marriage. Then he turned to his in-laws and proudly announced that they wouldn't have to put up with me much longer. He declared right there at the table that before the month was out, he was depositing me in a state-run nursing home. He laughed, actually laughed, as he laid out his plan to gut my living suite, knock out the walls, and convert the space into a luxury home theater. A room for watching movies held more worth to him than his own father. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't try to defend myself or remind him of who I was. I reached into my pocket, drew out my pressed linen pocket square, and methodically wiped the spit from my face. I folded the cloth, set it on the table beside the stained linen, and turned my back on all of them. I walked the length of that long, echoing hallway, opened the heavy oak front door, and stepped out into biting, freezing rain. I heard Brennan shout something from the dining room, probably in order to come back and clean up my mess. But the heavy thud of the door closing behind me cut his voice off forever. The rain soaked through my suit jacket in seconds, the cold driving straight into my bones, though I barely registered it. I climbed into my old, dependable Buick, both hands locked on the leather steering wheel until my knuckles went white. I drove without direction for miles, the rhythmic squeak of the windshield wipers, the only thing breaking the heavy quiet inside that car. The physical weight of the disrespect settled deep in my chest. This was the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle. This was the boy I had sat beside during thunderstorms. Now, he was a man who placed my dignity below a few drops of fermented grape juice. But as the miles accumulated, the crushing grief began to lift. In its place, something cold, calculating, and merciless took hold. I was not a victim. I was simply a man who had let a comfortable lie run far too long. I pulled off the highway and stopped in front of a rundown motel on the outer edge of Marietta, Georgia. Its neon sign flickered and buzzed in the damp night air. I paid cash for the room, avoiding the sympathetic gaze of the night clerk who was looking at a soaking wet old man standing in his lobby. The room carried the smell of stale smoke and industrial cleaner. Wallpaper curled away from the corners, and the mattress dipped badly in the middle. It was a stark, unsparing contrast to the sprawling suburban estate in Alpharetta, Georgia. In Alpharetta, Georgia, I had just walked away from. I peeled off my wet jacket, sat down on the stiff edge of the bed, and fixed my eyes on a blank wall. I didn't call anyone. I didn't look for comfort or apologies. Instead, I reached into my leather briefcase and lifted out my laptop. I set it on the scratched, rickety wooden desk in the corner. The story of my life was rewriting itself in real time. I was no longer the pitiful, dependent father. I was stepping back into the role I had filled for 40 years before retirement. I was returning to the mastermind. As I opened my secure banking portals, the screen's glow pushed back the dark of that motel room. The sheer absurdity of Brennan's arrogance was suddenly starkly visible. He and Serena loved parading before their wealthy circle, boasting about their self-made success and their magnificent $1.2 million estate. The reality was a carefully guarded secret I had kept to protect his fragile ego. I am a retired senior logistics executive. I spent 40 years constructing supply chains, overseeing hundreds of millions of dollars, and cutting inefficiencies out of corporate structures without sentiment. I am a very, very wealthy man. 3 years ago, Brennan's startup collapsed. He was drowning in debt, staring down foreclosure, and on the edge of losing Serena, who had married him solely for where she believed his financial trajectory was headed. To pull him back from the brink, I stepped in. I bought that magnificent sprawling suburban estate in Alpharetta, Georgia, entirely in cash. But I did not put his name on it. I acquired it through a private holding company, a blind LLC that I controlled entirely. I let Brennan live there rent-free. I let him tell Serena and her parents that he had bought it himself. I moved into the attached suite not because I needed somewhere to live, but because I wanted to remain close to my son. I let him play the lord of the manor while I quietly covered the property taxes, the insurance, and every major maintenance bill. Sitting at that motel desk, fingers moving across the keyboard, I decided the illusion was finished. I pulled up the accounts I'd used to quietly underwrite his life. Every month I had an automated transfer running to secretly pay down the enormous credit card balances he and Serena ran up trying to look rich. I navigated to the payment settings and clicked cancel. The satisfaction was immediate, but it wasn't enough. I needed to sever every financial thread between us. I began a thorough, systematic audit of every joint and linked account we had ever shared. That is when cold anger hardened into absolute ice. Scanning the transaction logs, I spotted a series of irregular, recurring withdrawals from a high-yield savings account. One I rarely visited, one that held the memorial charity fund I had established in honor of my late wife Brennan's mother. The fund existed to provide scholarships for underprivileged children. I clicked through to the cleared checks and brought up the digital images. My heart stopped, then hammered against my ribs with a violent fury. The signatures on the checks were mine, but they were sloppy, rushed forgeries. Brennan had been quietly draining thousands of dollars from his dead mother's memorial fund for the past 14 months. He was stealing from the legacy of the woman who gave him life to cover his country club dues and Serena's appetite for designer handbags. I leaned back in that cheap plastic motel chair, the laptop's shifting light reflected in my eyes. The last trace of paternal guilt vanished. Brennan hadn't merely disrespected me at dinner. He had desecrated his mother's memory. He wanted to warehouse me in a state facility and spend my money on a home theater. He had decided I was a naive, broken old man. He was about to learn that the man he spat on was the only thing standing between him and complete, crushing poverty. The line had been crossed, and I intended to dismantle his life with the surgical precision of a corporate executioner. The morning sun did nothing to take the chill out of the cold that had settled overnight in my bones. I left the rundown motel before the front desk clerk arrived for his shift and drove straight into the heart of the city through morning traffic steady and mechanical. My destination was a towering glass high-rise that housed the sharpest legal minds in the state. I rode the silent elevator up to the 38th floor and stepped out into the gleaming marble reception area of Holloway and Associates. Grant Holloway was not just an estate attorney, he was a predator dressed in a tailored Navy suit. We had worked side by side for nearly 2 decades during my corporate years. Grant was the man I called when negotiations turned ugly. He was the man who dismantled rival companies with a terrifying, methodical calm. When I walked into his corner office overlooking the sprawling city skyline, he took one look at my face and shut his laptop. He knew me well enough to read the dangerous stillness in my demeanor. He gestured for me to sit, setting aside his usual morning pleasantries. I settled into the deep leather chair across from his massive glass desk. Without a single word, I opened my briefcase. I pulled out a thick manila folder holding the printed bank statements, the transaction logs, and the high-resolution scans of the cleared checks. I slid the file across the smooth glass surface. Grant opened it carefully. For several long minutes, the only sound in that cavernous office was the crisp turning of pages. I watched his eyes move across the rows of figures tracing the systematic draining of the high-yield savings account. I watched his gaze lock onto the signature lines. Grant knew my handwriting perfectly. He had drafted my contracts, my trusts, and my will across the years. He recognized immediately that the sloppy, hurried cursive on those checks was not mine. But more than that, Grant knew precisely what that particular account had been established for. He had helped me create that memorial charity fund in the months after my wife passed. He knew it existed to fund scholarships for underprivileged children in her name. When he reached the final page laying out the total amount drained from his late friend's memorial fund, Grant removed his expensive reading glasses and set them on the desk. His jaw went tight, the professional mask dropping away entirely, replaced by a cold and predatory fury. He leaned forward, fingers steepled, and looked me straight in the eye. He told me this was no misunderstanding. This was not a clerical error or some youthful lapse in judgment. This was felony grand larceny severely aggravated by identity theft and wire fraud. Grant listed the criminal statutes Brennan had violated, his voice sharp and precise. He reached for the desk phone, his hand hovering just above the receiver. He offered to call the district attorney at that very moment. He told me he could have a warrant signed, a squad car dispatched, and Brennan hauled out of his bed in handcuffs before my son finished his morning coffee. He wanted to see Brennan pay for defiling my wife's memory. It was a deeply tempting offer. The image of Brennan being marched out of that sprawling suburban estate in Alpharetta, Georgia, in handcuffs, publicly humiliated, in front of his wealthy, arrogant in-laws, offered a brief, satisfying flash. But I reached out and gently pushed Grant's hand away from the receiver. I shook my head slowly. I told him no. I had no interest in the quick route. Prison was too fast and far too clean. Throwing him in a cell would hand Brennan exactly what he was looking for. It would let him play the victim. It would give him a ready-made excuse to blame the justice system, his bad luck, and a cruel, vindictive father for his sudden fall. He would sit behind bars convinced he was a successful man, unfairly targeted by a jealous old man. It would not teach him the real price of his blinding arrogance. I turned to look out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city far below, watching tiny cars crawl across the pavement like insects. I laid out my reasoning to Grant. I needed Brennan to experience a total, undeniable collapse, one entirely of his own making. I wanted a perfectly legal, absolute dismantling of his counterfeit empire. I wanted him to feel the walls drawing in day by day. I wanted him to wake up every single morning and watch another piece of his fraudulent life crumble to nothing, knowing he was completely powerless to stop it. I wanted the designer clothes, the country club memberships, and the luxury vehicles to evaporate into thin air. I wanted Serena, his shallow and materialistic wife, to see him for the broke, desperate fraud he truly was. I wanted to strip away every layer of his unearned privilege until there was nothing left but the harsh, unforgiving truth of his own failures. I wanted him to understand he was nothing without my quiet charity propping him up. Grant slowly pulled his hand back from the phone. A slow, calculated smile crossed his face. He eased back in his leather chair, tapping his chin, shifting gears from criminal prosecutor to corporate liquidator. He understood precisely what I was asking. We were not going to use the police or the criminal courts to bring him down. We were going to use the fine print. We were going to use the overwhelming, crushing weight of total financial liability. I told Grant I wanted every single lifeline severed immediately. Every safety net I had ever provided was to be incinerated completely, but it had to be legally airtight from every angle. Brennan could not have a single loophole to slip through. He could not be permitted to sue me, claim tenant rights, or drag things out through prolonged court battles. I demanded ironclad execution of his ruin. Grant opened a new digital file on his computer, the clicking of his keyboard sounding like a clock ticking down the final days of my son's comfort. He began pulling up the corporate structures, the blind limited liability companies I controlled, and the precise wording of the property deeds. We sat in that office for a long time, mapping out the architecture of Brennan's collapse. We traced the flow of money, identifying every vulnerability in my son's extravagant lifestyle. We were constructing a trap so vast and so seamless that Brennan would walk straight into it without ever glancing down. The theft from the memorial fund was the final nail in the coffin of my paternal mercy. My son thought he had conquered the world. He believed he was untouchable and superior. But sitting in that quiet, high-altitude office surrounded by legal documents and cold, hard facts, I knew the truth. His entire existence was a fragile house of cards, and I was holding the only match. Grant turned back to his sleek monitor. His hands moved across the keyboard with the speed of a predator that had caught the scent of blood. He told me that if we were going to sever the financial lifelines completely, we needed to know exactly how deep the rot had spread. As my estate attorney, he held the legal authority to run a comprehensive financial and asset trace on the accounts tied to my holding company. He pulled the credit reports, the asset ledgers, and the public municipal records connected to Brennan and his wife Serena. I sat in the stillness of the office, listening to the soft hum of the city outside the glass. I thought about the contemptuous way Serena had looked at me during the dinner party. I thought about the sheer entitlement radiating off my son as he performed for people who didn't truly care about him. They believed themselves untouchable members of the high society elite. Within 10 minutes, Grant turned his monitor to face me. The illusion of their grand life wasn't just fragile. It was a complete and total fabrication. Grant pointed to a glaring red column on the screen. He told me that without my secret monthly subsidies, Brennan and Serena were flat broke. They were drowning under a staggering $150,000 in hidden consumer debt. Not debt from bad investments, failed business ventures, or medical crises. Pure, unadulterated vanity. They had maxed out multiple high-tier credit cards just to hold on to their exclusive country club memberships. The luxury vehicles they proudly parked in the driveway of my sprawling suburban estate in Alpharetta, Georgia. In Alpharetta, Georgia, were leased at exorbitant interest rates they could not actually afford. Every tailored suit Brennan wore to look the part of a successful executive. Every designer handbag Serena flaunted in front of her circle. And every lavish dinner party they staged was built entirely on a foundation of crushing debt. They were scraping by month to month, barely meeting minimum payments. They were wholly dependent on the cash I was quietly funneling into their accounts to keep their house of cards from caving in. The sheer irony tasted bitter on my tongue. Brennan had spat on me. He had called me a useless freeloader, taking up space in his beautiful home. And yet he was the one secretly suffocating beneath a mountain of unpaid bills. He was nothing more than a desperate man playing dress-up with money he hadn't earned. He had bartered away his integrity for a lifestyle he could never sustain. But Grant was not finished. He clicked to another tab, pulling up the county's municipal tax records. His professional expression grew darker still. He asked me to look carefully at the property tax ledger for the estate. A cold, heavy knot tightened in my gut. 3 months earlier, I had handed Brennan a certified cashier's check for $30,000. I told him it was earmarked specifically for the property's annual tax bill. I had done it to let him stand tall as man of the house, letting him make the official payment under his own name, preserving what was left of his pride. Grant tapped the screen with his pen. The tax ledger showed a glaring delinquent status. The property taxes were 3 months past due. Brennan had never paid the county a dime. He had pocketed the $30,000 outright. He stole money meant to protect the very roof over his head, most likely feeding it straight into the minimum payments on his maxed-out credit cards, or bankrolling another one of Serena's extravagant shopping sprees. By lifting that tax money, Brennan had made a fatal, arrogant miscalculation. He had handed me the precise legal weapon I needed to bury him. Because the sprawling suburban estate in Alpharetta, Georgia, was legally held by my private holding company, his failure to pay the taxes as the resident acting tenant amounted to a direct, undeniable breach of our implied agreement. He had not simply stolen from me, he had legally put the property itself at risk. Grant looked me in the eye and said that this delinquency gave us immediate, indisputable grounds for a notice to vacate. Brennan had literally financed his own eviction. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair and felt the last traces of paternal mercy crumble to dust. My son was a thief, a liar, and a thoroughgoing fraud. He had taken my money, my patience, and my dignity, and traded every last bit of it for a pathetic illusion. I gave Grant a slow, deliberate nod. I told him to prepare the eviction documents right away. The era of silent subsidies was finished. I drove back to the sprawling suburban estate in Alpharetta, Georgia, just as the morning rush hour dissolved. The manicured neighborhood sat dead quiet. Landscapers and delivery drivers were the only figures moving along the wide tree-lined streets. I pulled my old dependable Buick into the long, paved driveway and killed the engine. I walked up to the heavy oak front door and turned my key in the lock. The house was completely still. Brennan and Serena were at their respective offices sitting through meetings, playing at Masters of the Universe, while their financial execution was already underway. The lingering scent of Serena's expensive floral perfume still drifted through the grand foyer, a cloying reminder of the toxic vanity that had poisoned this place. I moved through the massive house like a ghost. I did not pause to admire the crystal chandelier or the sweeping staircase. I walked straight down the long corridor to the back of the property and pushed open the door to the attached suite they had so generously allowed me to occupy. Looking at it now, the insult was impossible to miss. While they had filled the main house with custom Italian leather and imported marble, they had outfitted my space with cheap particle board furniture from a discount warehouse. The mattress was thin and unforgiving. The dresser drawers stuck every time I reached for them. They had treated me like an unwanted boarder in the very sanctuary my money had secured, giving me the bare minimum while hoarding every luxury for themselves. I felt no sadness when I opened the closet door. What I felt was an incredible, liberating lightness. I pulled 3 large, sturdy suitcases down from the top shelf. I had exactly 2 hours before Serena typically arrived home for her extended lunch break. 2 hours to pack up 72 years of my existence and disappear. I was methodical. There was no room for weeping over old memories or hesitating over keepsakes. I moved with the ruthless efficiency of a man cutting away a diseased limb to save his own life. Into the first suitcase went my clothing. The heavy wool sweaters, the tailored suits from my corporate years, the simple cotton shirts I wore when I wanted to blend in and play the quiet retiree. I cleared every shelf and emptied every basket. I left nothing behind but empty wooden hangers swinging softly on the rack. The second suitcase was reserved for the irreplaceable pieces of my life. I opened the small floor safe tucked in the back corner of the closet. I drew out the velvet boxes holding my late wife's jewelry, the pearl earrings I bought her for our 25th anniversary, the delicate silver locket she wore every single day until her last breath. I tucked them away carefully, making certain Brennan would never be able to pawn his mother's legacy to cover his country club dues. Next came the heavy leather-bound photo albums. I flipped through the pages for just a fraction of a second. I saw pictures of Brennan as a small boy grinning, holding my hand at the beach. I took the photos of my wife. I took the pictures of my old friends and my parents, but I deliberately removed the images of adult Brennan. I pulled the glossy prints of his wedding and his college graduation from their sleeves and left them scattered across the cheap discount dresser. He was no longer part of my history. I was erasing him from my future. The third suitcase was dedicated entirely to the architecture of his approaching ruin. I gathered every physical financial document I kept in the house. The original property deeds, the tax receipts, the birth certificates, the corporate ledgers from my blind holding companies. I swept the small desk completely clean, making absolutely certain I left no trace of my true net worth behind for them to stumble upon ahead of schedule. I packed my antique watches and the few gold coins I kept on hand for emergencies. I zipped all 3 heavy suitcases shut. The sound of the zippers was loud and final in the quiet room. I had brought Brennan into this world, and I had spent 36 years trying to hand him everything I never had. I had shielded him from failure, protected him from consequences, and bankrolled his arrogant delusions. All of the unconditional love, all of that blind paternal loyalty, had been reduced to 3 pieces of luggage. I looked around the room one last time. The space felt completely hollow. The cheap bed, the peeling nightstand, the awful polyester curtains Serena had chosen for me simply because they were on clearance. I was leaving it all exactly as it sat. Let them keep the cheap cast-offs they had deemed fitting from my final years. Let them have the empty shell of a room they were so eager to gut for their home theater. I gripped the handles and rolled the bags out of the suite, dragging the wheels down the long, hardwood hallway. I did not look back at the grand living room or the formal dining table where I had been humiliated the night before. I did not leave a dramatic note on the granite kitchen counter. I left no forwarding address, no list of demands, no tearful plea for reconciliation. Silence is the most terrifying sound to people who thrive on control and manipulation, and I knew it well. My absence would speak far louder than any argument I could have made. I loaded the heavy suitcases into the trunk and slammed it shut with a satisfying thud. The gray clouds from the night before were finally breaking open, letting the bright mid-morning sun pour through. I drew one deep breath of the crisp air. I was walking away from a toxic illusion. I settled into the driver's seat, turned the engine over, and pulled out of that driveway for the very last time. The trap was set, the evidence was secured, and I was entirely free. Before I stepped out the back door of the sprawling suburban estate in Alpharetta, Georgia, for good, I set my laptop on the smooth granite surface of the kitchen island for one final crucial task. Grant had just emailed over the expedited digital transfer documents. The $1.2 million property was currently held by a quiet, unassuming holding company I had built for privacy. But privacy was no longer the objective. Brutal, unforgiving corporate efficiency was. I opened the encrypted digital portal to Pinnacle Asset Group. Pinnacle Asset Group was a corporate entity I had constructed decades earlier during my logistics career, designed specifically to handle hostile commercial liquidations, aggressive asset recovery, and difficult corporate evictions. Pinnacle Asset Group was a faceless, soulless machine governed entirely by strict legal policy. It did not listen to sob stories. It did not negotiate with delinquent tenants, and it most certainly did not care about family ties. I moved the cursor and legally transferred the deed of the house from my private holding company directly into the iron grip of Pinnacle Asset Group. With that single digital signature, the house ceased to be a family home. It became immediately a corporate asset, flagged for aggressive liquidation on account of unpaid taxes. I watched the green confirmation banner flash across the glowing screen. The paperwork was filed with the county electronically. The trap was sealed. I shut the laptop, slid it into my leather briefcase, and wrapped my hands around the handles of my 3 heavy suitcases. I turned toward the back patio door, ready to disappear. But before my fingers could even graze the handle, a heavy thud from the front door reverberated through the grand foyer and stopped me cold. I froze, heart hammering, a steady, urgent warning against my ribs. Heavy footsteps began to roll across the imported marble floors. It wasn't just one person. 2 separate voices bounced off the soaring, vaulted ceilings of the hallway. I recognized the arrogant, booming tone the moment it reached me. It was Brennan. He was home hours ahead of schedule from his executive position, a position he was almost certainly neglecting in favor of playing the wealthy homeowner. He was laughing, a loud, self-congratulatory sound that scraped against every nerve I had. He was talking to another man, someone with a low, gruff voice. I pressed my back hard against the cold hallway wall, held my breath, and kept the wheels of my suitcases perfectly motionless on the hardwood floor. I listened from the shadows as Brennan steered the stranger directly toward my living suite. The man was a general contractor. Brennan was loud and proud as he laid out his sweeping architectural vision for my space. He told the contractor the suite was currently held up by a stubborn, dead-weight tenant, but that the problem was being permanently resolved, shipped off to a state facility before the month was out. I stood completely still in my own house, listening to my only son discuss my forced eviction the way another man might talk about hauling out the weekly garbage. He instructed the contractor to measure the load-bearing walls. He wanted them completely demolished. He bragged about importing tiered leather seating, a massive high-definition projection screen, and a custom wet bar for his new home theater. He spoke with the absolute unshakable certainty of a man who believed he owned the entire world, completely blind to the fact that he didn't own so much as the floorboards beneath his feet. The contractor paused and asked if they ought to step inside the suite right then to pull the exact measurements for the demolition. My grip tightened around the leather handles of my luggage. Blood rushed into my ears. If they turned that knob and walked through the door, they would find the stripped bed. They would find the empty closet. They would find me standing there with every bag packed. The entire silent operation would collapse into a premature, ugly confrontation. I needed him to bask in the false security of his imaginary wealth just a little longer. I needed the legal machinery to come down on him when he was least prepared for it. Brennan scoffed loudly. He told the contractor to hold off grumbling that the suite always reeked of old man, and he had no interest in dealing with my complaining today. He steered the contractor toward the exterior wall, instead suggesting they measure the footprint from the backyard to determine whether the foundation could be expanded. The moment their heavy footsteps shifted toward the side yard, I moved. I slipped out through the wide glass patio doors with the silence of a ghost. I pulled my luggage across the smooth stone pavers, head down, tucked into the deep shadows of the tall privacy hedges I had paid thousands of dollars to plant years before. I reached the back gate, eased the latch open with a quiet click, and stepped out into the empty alleyway behind the sprawling suburban estate in Alpharetta, Georgia. I walked 2 blocks down the street to where I had left my old dependable Buick, deliberately parked well away from the main driveway. I loaded the heavy bags into the trunk, closed it softly, and settled into the driver's seat. As I turned the key and the engine caught, I looked back through the rearview mirror at the towering roofline of the house. Brennan was inside those walls right now, tapping the drywall, dreaming of a luxury theater he would never build. He was sketching out renovations on credit cards that were already being declined. He was standing inside a property from which he was already legally removed. He was absolutely convinced he was the master of his domain. He had no idea the guillotine had already fallen. He simply hadn't felt the cold blade against his neck yet. I shifted into drive and pulled away, leaving him to his magnificent, ruinous illusion. 3 days passed since I slipped out the back gate of that sprawling suburban estate in Alpharetta, Georgia. 3 days of complete radio silence. I did not call to check in. I did not respond to the handful of irritated texts Brennan sent, demanding to know who was going to take out the garbage. Back at the house, Brennan and Serena were living in a state of pure arrogant ease. It was a crisp Tuesday morning. They were settled at the massive marble kitchen island. Serena was wearing a cashmere robe she had charged to a maxed-out credit card. She was sipping artisanal coffee, leafing through expensive interior design magazines, selecting the ideal tiered seating for the home theater they planned to carve out of my old suite. Brennan was likely propped against the counter, scrolling through his phone, feeling every bit the king of the castle. They were certain they had won. They read my absence as surrender. They figured the old man had finally swallowed his defeat and gone off quietly to find some cheap apartment before they had him moved to a state facility. The heavy iron door knocker shattered their perfect morning illusion. It was not a polite, tentative knock. It was sharp, rhythmic, and unmistakably authoritative. It was the kind of knock that does not wait for an answer, it demands one. Brennan set his coffee mug down on the granite counter with an annoyed sigh. He probably assumed it was a delivery driver dropping off another one of Serena's online orders, or perhaps a contractor showing up early to begin tearing apart my bedroom walls. He walked the length of the grand hallway chest, puffed out, fully prepared to assert himself over whoever was waiting on his porch. He swung the heavy oak door wide open, expensive leather slippers on his feet, a look of complete unearned entitlement on his face. Standing on the immaculate front porch was not a contractor. It was a tall, broad-shouldered man in a sharp-tailored navy suit. He held a thick black leather binder in his left hand. He did not smile. He offered no warm morning pleasantries. He was a senior field agent for Pinnacle Asset Group, the human face of the ruthless corporate machine I had set in motion against my own son. The agent looked Brennan over with cold, clinical indifference. He did not see a wealthy homeowner. He saw a delinquent liability. The agent asked to confirm that he was addressing Brennan Calloway, the current occupying tenant of the property. The word tenant hung in the crisp morning air like something rotten. Brennan stiffened immediately. The arrogant smile drained from his face. He pulled his shoulders back and sharply corrected the man, stating in no uncertain terms that he was not a tenant. He declared loudly that he was the rightful homeowner. The agent did not react to the outburst. He did not argue, and he did not apologize. He simply opened his leather binder, withdrew a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy watermarked paper, and extended them forward. He stated in a flat-measured monotone that Brennan was being served with an official 30-day notice to vacate the premises. Brennan stared at the papers, refusing to take them. For a moment, his mind couldn't find traction on the words. The agent kept talking, his voice carrying the slow, unstoppable weight of the law. He explained that the eviction was being executed immediately on the basis of severe documented lease violations. He listed each infraction with surgical precision. First, the occupying resident had failed to remit the county property taxes, producing a 3-month delinquency that legally endangered the holding company's asset. Second, the resident had brought unauthorized contractors onto the property to plan structural demolition without the express written consent of the legal ownership. As a result of these violations, all occupancy privileges were permanently revoked. Brennan finally snatched the papers from the agent's hand. He let out a loud barking laugh, the kind built entirely on delusion and a fragile ego. He glanced back at Serena, who had drifted into the foyer, clutching her coffee mug, and told her some scam artist was out there trying to steal their house. He turned back to the agent face, flushing a deep, angry crimson. He lost his composure entirely. He jabbed a finger directly at the agent's chest, his voice carrying across the quiet, manicured neighborhood. Brennan aggressively ordered the agent off his property before he called the police and had him arrested for trespassing. He shouted that there was no lease agreement. He shouted that he did not have a landlord. He declared with full chest that every brick, every blade of grass, and every square inch of that $1.2 million estate was his. The tax delinquency, he insisted, was a simple banking error his father was already sorting out, a trivial clerical matter that was none of their concern. He crumpled the top sheet of the eviction notice in his fist, completely blind to what was actually happening around him. The agent didn't flinch. He didn't take a single step back. He simply stood there watching my son throw his fit with the detached expression of someone who handled hostile evictions for a living. Brennan was a man standing on the deck of a sinking ship, screaming at the water that he controlled the tides. He had no idea the ocean was about to pull him under. He believed he could bully reality into submission the same way he had bullied his father his entire life. But Pinnacle Asset Group had no interest in his pride. They cared only about the name printed on the deed, and my son was about to discover he didn't own a single letter of it. The Pinnacle agent stood completely unmoved by the screaming and the aggressive posturing. I know precisely how every moment of that confrontation unfolded, because firms like Pinnacle require their field agents to wear lapel cameras during hostile evictions, protection against liability claims. Sitting comfortably on my sunlit balcony miles away, I watched the high-definition footage of my son's hollow empire collapsing, and it remains the greatest return on investment I have ever witnessed. The agent didn't bother arguing with Brennan. He simply reached into his thick leather binder and produced a second stack of documents. He extended his arm, offering Brennan the certified chain of title and the full unredacted deed history for the property. Brennan snatched the papers from the agent's grip, his eyes darting frantically across the dense legal text. He was searching desperately for a typo, a clerical mistake, any minor flaw he could use to expose the agent as a fraud. He scanned down the page until he hit the registered ownership history. He saw the name of the private holding company. Then his eyes dropped to the line, identifying the sole controlling member of that corporate entity. He read my name. He read it again. The agent spoke with calm surgical precision, explaining that the limited liability company that had purchased the home in cash 3 years prior was entirely funded, operated, and owned by his father. The change in my son was instant and total. The puffed-up aggressive tyrant who had so proudly spat in my face simply evaporated. In his place stood a frightened, powerless little boy. The color drained from his face rapidly, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. His hands began to shake so violently that the legal papers rattled against each other in the still morning air. He opened his mouth to speak, to argue, to yell at the agent, and nothing came out. The full crushing weight of his reality had finally caved in on him. He did not own the property. He had never owned a single brick of it. He was nothing more than an unwelcome guest who had been living entirely on my quiet generosity. And that generosity had just been permanently revoked. Serena, sensing the sudden and terrifying shift in her husband's composure, stepped out of the grand foyer and onto the front porch. She pulled her cashmere robe tighter around her shoulders, eyes moving nervously between the stone-faced corporate agent and her trembling husband. She snatched the papers clean out of Brennan's loosening grip. Her eyes shot across the legal language and landed on the same undeniable truth that had just paralyzed my son. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Serena slowly raised her gaze from the documents and looked directly at Brennan. What was in her eyes was not the look of a devoted wife bracing herself to face hardship alongside the man she loved. It was the cold, furious stare of a predator who had just realized she'd walked straight into a trap. She had married a man she was certain was a self-made millionaire. She had built her entire identity around that sprawling suburban estate in Alpharetta, Georgia. In Alpharetta, Georgia, boasting endlessly to her pretentious parents and her country club friends about the massive home her successful husband had bought. Now standing barefoot on that porch, she held the certified legal proof that her whole marriage had been constructed on a pathetic lie. Her voice cut through the silence sharp and venomous. She didn't ask Brennan whether the documents were accurate. She demanded to know why he had been lying to her for years. She demanded to know why the house they lived in belonged to the useless old man she so thoroughly despised. Brennan stumbled backward, hands raised in a weak defensive gesture. He stammered frantically, trying to spin a fresh lie to bury the old ones. He claimed it was a complicated tax arrangement, a temporary financial structure, a simple misunderstanding he could clear up in 5 minutes if she'd just let him call his lawyer. But Serena was done listening to his excuses. The flawless facade of the perfect wealthy couple shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces right there on the welcome mat. She started screaming at him, her voice carrying down the manicured street for every wealthy judgmental neighbor to hear. She called him a complete fraud. She called him a broke, pathetic liar. She screamed that she had thrown away the best years of her life on a man who couldn't even afford a roof over his own head without crawling back to his daddy for a handout. Brennan frantically begged her to keep her voice down. He looked around in wild-eyed panic, terrified that the neighbors backing out of their driveways were catching every word of his humiliating reality being broadcast to the whole subdivision. His obsession with appearances was still clinging to life, but Serena wanted him to burn. She wanted everyone to know she'd been deceived. She hurled the thick stack of property deeds directly into his chest, letting the pages scatter across the porch and drift into the pristine landscaping. The Pinnacle agent made no move to insert himself into their domestic collapse. He simply reached into his binder one final time, produced the formal 30-day notice to vacate, and tucked it securely beneath the heavy iron door knocker. He calmly informed them that the eviction clock had officially begun, turned on his heel, and walked back to his vehicle. He drove away and left them standing on that porch, tearing each other apart. The alliance they had forged on vanity, greed, and their shared contempt for my presence was completely finished, dismantled in minutes by a handful of papers bearing my name. My phone sat on the tempered glass table, buzzing with a violent, relentless rhythm. It vibrated, skittered across the smooth surface, went silent for exactly 3 seconds, then started all over again. I didn't reach for it. I simply watched the screen light up, casting a faint glow across my porcelain coffee mug. Brennan's name flashed on the caller ID over and over. When he realized I wasn't going to answer, the barrage of text messages started. I settled back into my plush lounge chair, wrapped in a thick cotton robe, and took a slow, unhurried sip of freshly brewed premium coffee. The flavor was rich and dark, a vast improvement over the cheap generic grounds Serena used to stock for me to keep in my attached suite. I let the warmth settle in my throat as I looked past the buzzing phone and out toward the horizon. There was no manicured lawn stretching out before me, no arrogant neighbors, no pretentious dinner parties, no toxic whispers trailing down a hallway. There was only the wide, deep blue expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The steady rhythm of waves breaking against the white sand far below completely swallowed the pathetic buzzing of my phone. The morning after I slipped out through the back gate of that house of lies, I hadn't gone looking for some small, lonely apartment. I had walked directly into a premier coastal real estate office and purchased a stunning penthouse condo on Sea Island, Georgia. I paid cash in full, no mortgage, no background check, no closing delays. The property was a masterpiece of modern design, with floor-to-ceiling windows, a wraparound balcony, and complete uninterrupted privacy. This was what decades of corporate discipline and financial sacrifice had actually built. For 3 years, I had kept my net worth hidden, living like a pauper in a discount bedroom, so my son could play at being a king. Now, I was finally directing my wealth toward the only thing that had ever genuinely mattered: absolute peace of mind. My phone lit up again. This time, Brennan left a voicemail. The transcription appeared automatically on my screen, letting me read his desperation, without having to hear the panic cracking through his voice. His texts were a masterclass in psychological unraveling. He lurched wildly between explosive entitled fury and pathetic groveling desperation. The opening message dripped with venom. He demanded I pick up the phone that instant. He screamed that I had no right whatsoever to sell the house, out from under him, swearing he'd sue me for everything I had and drag my reputation through the gutter. He ordered me to contact the property management company and kill the eviction, insisting he was the victim of a malicious corporate scheme. But as the hours ticked past and the weight of his situation settled in, the rage dissolved into pure, unfiltered terror. The messages that followed became frantic pleas. He begged me to answer. He wept that Serena was throwing her bags together and screaming at him. He pleaded with me to come back and make it right, swearing things would be different, that they'd show me the respect I was owed. He even tried to weaponize his late mother's memory, sobbing into the phone that she'd be devastated to see me walk away from my only son in his darkest hour. A few days earlier, a message like that might have cut straight through me. I might have felt that old familiar drag of paternal guilt. I might have grabbed my keys, driven back to the sprawling suburban estate in Alpharetta, Georgia, and written another enormous check to insulate him from the wreckage of his own decisions. But sitting on that sun-soaked balcony, pulling in the sharp, salty ocean air, I felt absolutely nothing. The guilt had burned off, completely consumed by the memory of his spit sliding down my cheek. I didn't block his number. Blocking him would have been a kindness. It would have given him the illusion that I was hiding, that I feared a confrontation. By leaving the line open and ignoring every notification, I was sending a far more devastating message. I was showing him he was utterly irrelevant. I was making him scream into a complete void, yelling until his throat gave out. Knowing that the man who had fixed every problem in his life was sitting in stillness, consciously choosing not to rescue him. Another text appeared on the screen, a single desperate sentence asking how he was supposed to get by. I lifted my coffee mug, tilted my head back against the cushions of my chair, and let my eyes fall shut. The morning sun lay warm across my face. Somewhere out there, a seagull cried. The waves came in steady and indifferent to the chaos tearing through a sprawling suburban estate in Alpharetta, Georgia, miles away. I had spent 36 years of my life trying to construct a safe, comfortable world for Brennan. I had surrendered my own peace so he would never have to brush up against the harsh, unforgiving edges of reality. But I had finally absorbed the hardest lesson any father can learn. You cannot purchase character. You cannot finance integrity. And you cannot build a soul by handing someone everything. I had shaped him into a man who placed value on absolutely nothing. I turned the phone face down on the glass table. The buzzing became a muffled, distant hum, swallowed whole by the immensity of the ocean. I owed him no explanation. I owed him no second chance. I had handed him the world, and he had chosen to spit on it. Now he would have to figure out how to exist in a world that cared nothing for his designer wardrobe or his country club memberships. He'd have to learn what it meant to stand on his own. I took another slow, deliberate sip of coffee, savoring the deep flavor and the exquisite absolute silence of my new life. My son lacked the emotional maturity to accept defeat. In his mind, I was simply a foolish old man, throwing a ridiculous fit over a spilled glass of wine. He genuinely believed the eviction notice taped to his front door was nothing but a scare tactic. He figured that because he had spent his entire adult life successfully bullying me into giving way, he could bully the legal system just as easily. He refused to grasp that the money fueling his arrogance had dried up for good. Rather than pack his bags or hunt for a modest apartment, he chose to fight the corporate machine I had set loose on him. He pulled on his most expensive tailored suit, the one I'd paid for 3 years back. He buckled a heavy designer watch to his wrist and drove his leased sports car straight into the Midtown Atlanta financial corridor. He was looking for the most aggressive real estate litigation firm he could track down. I know precisely how that humiliating scene played out because the legal community in our city is extraordinarily small. The managing partner of the firm Brennan chose happens to play golf at the same private club as my attorney Grant Holloway. Brennan walked into their plush penthouse reception area, carrying himself like a billionaire who had been gravely wronged. He demanded an immediate audience with a senior partner. He sank into a plush leather chair, sipped imported sparkling water, and spun an elaborate web of lies. He told the attorney with full confidence that a rogue property management company was attempting to illegally seize his family estate because of a minor clerical error made by his confused senile father. He spoke with the unearned authority of someone who believed his last name alone commanded unconditional respect. The lawyer listened without interruption. Men in those high-altitude offices are predators who deal strictly in cold, hard cash. They have no interest in family drama or sob stories. Billable hours are all that matter. The attorney nodded with practiced sympathy and told Brennan that fighting a hostile corporate eviction from a faceless entity like Pinnacle Asset Group would demand an immediate and massive legal response. He laid out that drafting the injunctions needed to halt the 30-day countdown would consume substantial firm resources. To get started, he required a $10,000 retainer paid in full up front. Brennan didn't so much as blink. He reached confidently into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and drew out his designer leather wallet. He slid a heavy metal platinum credit card out and set it down on the gleaming walnut desk with a smug, self-satisfied smile. He fully expected the attorney to take it, run it, and immediately begin fighting on his behalf. It was the exact way he'd moved through his entire life, just throwing my money at a problem until it went away. But Brennan had overlooked one critical detail. That gleaming platinum card was tied directly to the primary funding account I had already gutted and closed 3 days before. The attorney picked up the card and handed it to his paralegal to process the retainer. Brennan leaned back, crossed his legs, entirely prepared to dictate his terms, but the comforting illusion of his wealth was about to collapse in the most excruciating way imaginable. The paralegal ran the card through the terminal. The machine let out a sharp, unforgiving beep. The screen flashed a red error message: transaction declined. The paralegal calmly informed Brennan the card hadn't gone through. Brennan produced a dismissive, nervous laugh. He waved his hand with practiced arrogance, blaming a security freeze at the bank. He claimed the bank was always flagging his account because of the volume of large luxury purchases he made. He reached back into his wallet and produced a second card, a premium travel rewards card. He handed it over and assured them it would clear without a hitch. The paralegal swiped the second card. The machine beeped again. Declined. The screen indicated the account was fully frozen due to severe delinquency. The entire atmosphere in the room shifted on the spot. The attorney's polished, deferential manner evaporated completely. Time is money in the Midtown Atlanta financial corridor, and the lawyer could suddenly smell insolvency radiating off my son. A cold sweat crept across Brennan's forehead. The color drained from his face as the terrifying truth of his situation began to punch through his denial. His hands trembled slightly as he dug through his wallet, hunting desperately for a third option. He produced a standard bank credit card, his absolute last resort. He passed it to the paralegal with a pleading, hollow look in his eyes. The machine showed no mercy. It beeped a third time. Declined. The attorney rose from behind his desk. He offered neither a polite smile nor a sympathetic word. He looked down at Brennan with naked, unadulterated contempt. He saw straight through the tailored suit and the expensive watch. He saw a man who couldn't cover a cup of coffee, let alone bankroll a high-stakes real estate litigation fight. The attorney told Brennan coldly that the consultation was finished and asked him to leave the office immediately. Panic swallowed my son whole. He understood that without legal representation, he was going to lose the house, the cars, and the entire false identity he'd constructed. He snapped and started to shout. He demanded they run the cards again, insisting the machine was faulty. He screamed that his father was a wealthy logistics executive who could purchase their entire law firm with a single phone call. What comes next is the moment I had been quietly building toward for a very long time, and the weight of it still sits with me. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If someone you loved and provided for had been working against you in secret, would you confront them the moment you found out? or would you wait until every piece of evidence was locked in place? He swore that $10,000 would be wired before the day was out, but his word meant nothing. The attorney pressed a button beneath his desk and called for building security. Two broad-shouldered guards stepped into the office and seized Brennan by the arms. He thrashed and hollered, making an enormous scene. They physically hauled him out of the private office and dragged him through the packed reception area. Dozens of wealthy clients, prominent business owners, and high-powered lawyers paused to stare at the commotion. Brennan was shoved into the public elevator, utterly humiliated. Whatever pride he had left shattered against the marble floor of a building he had assumed was his domain. He rode down to the lobby in complete silence, the realization finally sinking in that his money, his influence, and his standing were entirely gone. Grant Holloway called me that afternoon, barely containing his laughter, as he walked me through everything he'd heard from the managing partner. But I hadn't needed Grant to fill me in. Out on the sun-drenched balcony of my penthouse condo on Sea Island, Georgia, I already knew. Earlier that morning, I had set my cell phone on the glass table. As I sipped my coffee and watched the waves roll in off the Atlantic Ocean, the screen had lit up 3 separate times. The automated banking app I'd installed was sending me real-time notifications of rejected charges. Attempted charge $10,000 declined. Attempted charge $10,000 declined. Attempted charge $10,000 declined. I watched those alerts stack up on the screen and drew in a slow, steady breath of salt air. The financial guillotine had dropped, and my son was left with absolutely nothing. He drove back to the sprawling suburban estate in Alpharetta, Georgia. In dead silence. The plush leather seats of his least expensive luxury car gave him no comfort whatsoever. He had walked into the Midtown Atlanta financial corridor, expecting to bend the world to his will, and had been thrown out like a common vagrant. When he pushed open the heavy oak front door of the house, the cold, hard truth of his situation was already waiting. Serena was pacing the grand foyer. She hadn't started loading her designer bags just yet, but the look in her eyes told him he was running out of runway fast. She demanded to know what the high-powered lawyer had said. She demanded to know precisely how they were going to stop the eviction and protect their lifestyle. Brennan couldn't bring himself to admit that his premium credit cards were maxed out and frozen solid. His fragile ego simply wouldn't let him confess to his wife that he was flat broke and completely powerless. So, he lied. He told her the attorney needed a few more days to process the injunction and that a large sum of cash was already in motion to settle the property dispute once and for all. It was a hollow, desperate lie, meant only to buy him a few more hours of breathing room. Serena scoffed, folded her arms, and told him he had exactly 24 hours to produce the money, or she was calling her parents to come get her. Brennan retreated to his home office and locked the heavy wooden door behind him. He sank into his expensive ergonomic chair and stared at a blank computer screen. The arrogance that had always carried him evaporated, completely replaced by a suffocating, paralyzing panic. He logged into his personal banking portal, desperate for some kind of miracle. The numbers staring back at him were brutal and unforgiving. His primary checking account was overdrawn. His savings account was empty. The credit cards he had relied on for extravagant dinners and exclusive country club dues were locked due to severe delinquency. He was cornered on every side. No lawyer, no cash, and a 30-day eviction notice taped to his front door. Desperation is a terrifying emotion. It strips away logic and basic morality and leaves behind nothing but the raw urge to survive. Brennan needed money, and he needed it now. He needed a massive infusion of cash to hire attorneys, quiet his furious wife, and keep the fragile, crumbling illusion of his success from collapsing entirely. He opened a new browser tab and pulled up a major online lending institution. He clicked on the application for a $50,000 expedited personal loan. He started entering his own information into the fields, then stopped before hitting submit. Brennan knew his credit score was in ruins. The mountain of consumer debt he'd been concealing from Serena guaranteed an instant rejection. The automated system would kick him out before he even closed the browser window. He sat in the darkened office, gnawing his thumbnail, his mind scrambling for any way out. That's when sheer desperation drove my son across a very dark and permanent legal line. Brennan pulled open a locked bottom drawer in his desk and lifted out a thick manila folder. Inside were old tax documents and medical forms he had helped me complete years earlier when I first moved into the attached suite at the property. He spread the papers across the surface of his desk and stared directly at my private information. My full legal name, my date of birth, my social security number. In his panicked, twisted mind, he had no trouble justifying what he was about to do. He told himself I owed him this money for embarrassing him in front of his wealthy in-laws at the dinner party. He convinced himself I was nothing more than a confused old man sitting alone in a rundown motel on the outer edge of Marietta, Georgia. He genuinely believed I didn't understand modern online banking, that I would never pull my annual credit report, and that I would likely be gone long before any massive loan ever went into default. He looked at my pristine decades-long credit history, not as a lifetime of hard work and financial discipline, but as an untapped resource sitting there for his own immediate survival. Brennan deleted his own name from the online application. With trembling fingers, he began typing my personal information into the glowing digital fields. He entered my social security number. He listed my annual retirement income, with the figures significantly inflated to ensure rapid, unquestioned approval. He requested a $50,000 wire transfer deposited directly into a brand new checking account he had opened exclusively in his own name. He reached the bottom of the form. The screen asked him to verify his identity and sign the legally binding financial contract. He didn't hesitate. He didn't feel a single ounce of guilt or remorse for stealing his own father's identity. He typed my full legal name into the digital signature box, ticked the confirmation checkbox, declaring all information true and accurate under penalty of perjury, and hit submit. He leaned back and let out a long, shaky breath. He watched the loading circle spin on the screen, fully expecting the automated lending system to hand him the $50,000 he desperately needed to salvage his fake empire. He thought he had outsmarted the system. He thought he had found the perfect victimless crime to pull himself out of the catastrophic financial wreckage he had created. He had no idea he had just wrapped a federal noose tightly around his own neck and kicked the chair out from under himself. I was on my balcony watching the afternoon sun play across the Atlantic Ocean. The steady ocean breeze was cool and unhurried, entirely removed from the suffocating panic my son was drowning in miles away. I'd spent the last few hours settling into my new life, arranging golf tee times, looking into local charity boards. I was no longer the invisible old man tucked away in an attached suite. But even while I was finally embracing my freedom, I knew my son was a cornered animal, and cornered animals always make fatal, predictable mistakes. I had spent 40 years in corporate logistics, anticipating worst-case scenarios and engineering fail-safes to contain them. I knew Brennan better than he knew himself. I knew that once I cut off his financial lifelines, his ego would never let him immediately downsize or admit defeat. I knew he'd go hunting for a shortcut to preserve his lavish lifestyle. That's precisely why, the morning after I packed my 3 suitcases and slipped out the back gate, I made one very important phone call. I didn't simply cancel my credit cards. I placed an absolute ironclad hard freeze and a severe fraud alert on my entire social security number and credit profile across all 3 major bureaus. I locked my financial identity inside an impenetrable digital vault. I specifically mandated that no new lines of credit loans or financial inquiries could be authorized without my direct verbal confirmation and a multi-step authentication process. I knew that when the eviction notice landed and the high-powered attorneys threw him out of their offices, Brennan would go looking for any source of cash he could find. I fully expected him to try and raid my accounts, but I wanted to see exactly how far his arrogance would push him. I wanted to know whether he was desperate enough to cross a line he could never come back from. The answer came at precisely 2:04 hours in the afternoon. My cell phone rested on the glass patio table, quietly accumulating unread texts and missed calls from Brennan all morning. But this notification was something else entirely, not the gentle chime of a text message. This was a loud, piercing, high-priority alert from my primary banking institution. I picked up the phone and unlocked the screen. A bright red banner filled the display. The automated security system had flagged a critical breach. I tapped the notification and opened the secure banking app. My son's desperation was laid out before me in cold, hard data. The system reported a highly suspicious attempt to open an unsecured $50,000 personal loan using my full legal name and my private social security number. The application had been digitally signed and submitted just minutes earlier. The automated system had also captured the exact IP address and geographical location of the device, used to file the fraudulent application. The coordinates pointed directly to the $1.2 million sprawling suburban estate in Alpharetta, Georgia, I had just evicted him from. Because I had proactively set the maximum security clearance level, the bank didn't simply turn down the loan. The algorithm recognized the unauthorized use of a frozen social security number as a deliberate malicious cyber crime. The screen updated in real time, explicitly stating that the transaction had been immediately blocked and automatically flagged as a felony identity theft attempt. My son had not merely failed to get his money. He had electronically handed federal financial regulators a signed, documented confession of grand larceny. Brennan thought he was working a slow, senile old man who didn't understand technology. He believed he could steal $50,000 to pay off his furious wife and retain expensive lawyers to fight my eviction notice. Instead, he had walked blindly into a highly sophisticated digital snare. The system was now locking down his application, routing the fraudulent data straight to the bank's internal fraud investigation unit. He had handed me the absolute power to destroy not just his manufactured wealth, but his very freedom. I stared at the red alert on my screen, a profound sense of finality settling over me. A part of me, the small remaining piece of the father who had raised him, felt a brief flicker of sorrow. He had completely dismantled his own life simply because he refused to live within his means and extend basic human respect to the man who gave him everything. But that sorrow was quickly swallowed by a wave of cold, absolute justice. He had made his choice. I took a slow sip of my coffee, set the phone back on the glass table, and watched the ocean waves roll in. The machine was in motion, and there was nothing Brennan could do to stop it. I was still out on my balcony, the ocean breeze cooling my face when my phone rang. Not the relentless, panicked buzzing from my son. It was a crisp, professional ringtone I had assigned specifically to my wealth management team. I answered immediately. The voice on the other end belonged to the senior director of the bank's fraud prevention unit. He informed me that their automated security algorithms had intercepted a sophisticated attempt to open a massive unsecured loan using my frozen social security number. He explained that, because of the strict security protocols I had established, the application was immediately blocked, and the incident had been automatically flagged for federal review. He asked whether I had authorized any family member or legal representative to apply for a $50,000 loan on my behalf. I told him with complete and unwavering certainty that I had not. I confirmed the application was entirely fraudulent. The director's tone shifted from professional concern to strict legal protocol. He explained that, given the amount requested and the use of digital forgery, the bank was legally obligated to report the incident to the authorities as felony identity theft and wire fraud. He advised me that federal investigators would likely be reaching out in the coming days. I thanked the director for his diligence, ended the call, and immediately dialed Grant Holloway. My attorney picked up on the first ring. I walked him through the conversation I just had with the bank's fraud department, laying out every detail of Brennan's desperate and fatal mistake. I expected Grant to launch immediately into an aggressive legal strategy, perhaps drafting a civil lawsuit to compound Brennan's misery. Instead, Grant laughed. It was a cold, sharp laugh that rang through the receiver. He told me to do absolutely nothing. He said to pour myself another cup of coffee, settle back, and enjoy the sunset. By triggering a felony fraud alert through a federally insured banking institution, Brennan had essentially done our jobs for us. The automated banking laws were merciless. The banking system had no interest in family drama, spoiled children, or petty grievances. It existed solely to protect its assets from criminal activity. Grant assured me the bank's internal investigators would automatically trace the IP address back to the Alpharetta property, cross-reference the application details, and hand a perfectly packaged, undeniable case of felony identity theft directly to the police. We didn't need to lift a single finger. The machine was already moving, and it would crush Brennan with cold, bureaucratic efficiency. Grant advised that when the authorities inevitably called, I was to simply confirm the facts that my identity had been stolen, that I had not authorized any loan, and that I wished to press full charges against whoever was responsible. Let the police do the heavy lifting. Brennan had built his own gallows, and now we only had to watch him kick the chair out from under himself. Back at the sprawling suburban estate in Alpharetta, Georgia, Brennan was still seated in his locked home office, eyes fixed on his computer screen. The loading circle had finally stopped spinning, but the screen did not flash a bright green approval. There was no confirmation that $50,000 was on its way to rescue his manufactured empire. Instead, his inbox chimed with an automated email from the lending institution. The subject line was stark and terrifying. Notice of fraudulent activity and federal review. Brennan clicked on the email, his hands shaking so violently he could barely keep hold of the mouse. The text was brutal and unforgiving. It stated that his application had been flagged for serious security violations, involving the unauthorized use of a frozen social security number. It informed him that the transaction had been halted, his newly opened checking account was frozen pending investigation, and the incident had been automatically referred to federal financial regulators for suspected felony identity fraud. The email offered no customer service number to call. There was no option to appeal or clarify the situation. It was a cold automated notification informing him that he had just committed a serious crime and that the authorities were already involved. The suffocating panic that had driven him to forge my signature was instantly replaced by deep, paralyzing terror. He understood he was no longer simply a broke man facing an embarrassing eviction. He was a criminal, staring down serious prison time. He had used his own computer on his own home network to submit a fraudulent federal loan application. He had left a massive, undeniable digital trail leading straight back to his desk. He couldn't chalk this up to a misunderstanding. He couldn't claim he had my authorization, not when I had just legally evicted him from the house. He had knowingly and deliberately stolen my identity to secure a massive sum of cash. The walls of his home office suddenly felt like a prison cell. The expensive ergonomic chair felt like an electric chair. He was trapped. He frantically moved to delete his browsing history, clear his cache, and scrub any digital trace of his crime. He worked with manic, terrified energy, desperately trying to undo the fatal error he had just made. But he knew it was pointless. The bank already had his IP address, his digital signature, and the fraudulent application secured in their servers. The evidence was beyond his reach. He sank back into his chair, breathing ragged and shallow. The illusion of his success, his wealth, his power shattered completely. He was a broke, desperate fraud who had committed a felony simply because he refused to own his failures. He understood now that his father, the man he had sneered at and dismissed as a useless freeloader, had outmaneuvered him at every single turn. He had stumbled blindly into an impenetrable digital trap, and he was going to lose absolutely everything. Brennan sat frozen in that ergonomic chair. The bright glow of his computer screen lit up the absolute terror written across his face. The automated email from the lending institution stared back at him, explicitly stating that his application was under federal review for felony identity theft. He was so paralyzed by the sudden collapse of his life that he never heard the heavy oak door to his home office swing open. Serena appeared in the doorway. She was still wearing her expensive cashmere robe, but the arrogant impatience she had carried all morning was gone. She had spent the last hour pacing the grand foyer, waiting for Brennan to emerge with a brilliant legal strategy to save their mansion. When he never emerged, Serena decided she'd had enough waiting. She stepped up behind him, her gaze sharpening as it swept across his shaking shoulders. She read the bold red text staring back at her from the monitor. The words, fraud, federal review, and identity theft hung there in glaring capitals. Serena was a lot of things, but slow wasn't one of them. Her eyes jumped from the damning email to the pile of old tax documents stacked on the desk beside it. She recognized my name and my social security number printed right there on the forms. The full weight of what she was looking at hit her like a wall of concrete. Brennan hadn't simply failed to retain a lawyer. He had made a desperate play to steal $50,000 by forging his own father's identity, and he'd been caught the moment he tried it. Serena understood then that the man seated in front of her was no misunderstood millionaire. He was a broke, incompetent criminal, counting down the hours until he was hauled out in handcuffs. Brennan finally found his voice. He swung his chair around, hands raised in a pathetic pleading gesture. He tried to spin a new lie, stammering that the email was nothing but a banking glitch he could straighten out with a single phone call. He begged her to stay calm, swearing everything would be resolved by morning. Serena didn't scream. She didn't hurl anything or demand a point-by-point explanation. The blazing fury that had gripped her on the front porch earlier that morning went absolutely cold, not warm anger, but deep airless ice. The look she fixed on her husband was one of pure undiluted disgust. She no longer saw a partner or a provider. She saw a vessel going under, and Serena was not the kind of woman to drown alongside the captain. Without uttering a word, she pivoted and walked out of the home office. Brennan lurched up from his chair and chased her down the long hardwood hallway, pleading for her to hear him out. He trailed behind her like a frightened, desperate child as she marched straight into the sweeping master bedroom. Serena went directly to her vast walk-in closet. She yanked down 3 large, expensive designer suitcases and flung them across the plush mattress. She began stripping her imported dresses, designer shoes, and high-end handbags from the racks with methodical brutality. There was nothing frantic about it. She moved with ruthless, deliberate efficiency. She didn't fold a single thing. She stuffed thousands of dollars worth of luxury goods into the luggage, driven by the single-minded need to salvage the only assets she still had claim to. Brennan stood in the bedroom doorway, eyes blown wide with panic. He begged her to stop. He sobbed that they were a team, that married people were supposed to shoulder hard times together. He implored her to stay and help him find some way to explain the fraudulent loan application to the authorities. Serena stopped for just a moment. She zipped the first heavy suitcase shut and looked squarely at the man she had vowed to love, for better or for worse. Then she delivered a verbal strike so precise it shattered whatever thin shell of ego Brennan still had. She told him she had married a successful executive, not a pathetic fraud propped up by his father's secret handouts. She made it clear she had absolutely no intention of spending her best years visiting a federal correctional facility or squeezing into some cramped, cheap apartment while he clawed his way out from under a mountain of consumer debt. She picked up her phone from the nightstand. She opened her banking app and went straight to their joint checking account. Brennan watched in horror as her thumb moved across the glowing screen. She checked the balance. 3 months of unpaid property taxes and severely delinquent credit card bills had whittled it down to a pitiful $400. That was every last drop of liquid cash they had between them. Serena didn't pause. 2 quick taps, and the entire $400 moved directly into her private individual account. She zeroed out the joint account without blinking. She glanced up from the screen and told Brennan in a flat, even tone that the money would cover getting her to her parents' house. She was walking out the instant the luxury evaporated, not a moment later. Brennan dropped to his knees on the thick bedroom carpet. His hands shot out and seized the hem of her cashmere robe, and he sobbed without restraint. He begged her not to leave him alone in that house. He cried that he had nothing left. No money, no lawyer, no family. Serena wrenched her robe free from his grip. She grabbed her designer luggage by the handles and rolled it right past him. She walked down the sweeping staircase and straight out through the heavy oak front door. She never looked back. The door slammed shut behind her, the sharp final crack of it rolling through the high vaulted ceilings of the grand foyer. Brennan was left kneeling on the floor of the vast, empty master bedroom. The silence inside the $1.2 million estate was suffocating in a way that felt almost physical. He was completely alone. No wife, no father, no money, no future. He was sitting inside a property from which he had been legally evicted, waiting for federal investigators to come knocking. The illusion had collapsed entirely, and the reality he'd constructed for himself was a cold, inescapable trap. That silence was no longer simply quiet. It pressed down on him from every corner of the room, like something alive. Every high vaulted ceiling seemed to close in another inch. The front door had taken the last fragment of his manufactured life with it when it slammed. He was utterly, completely alone. He drifted out of the master bedroom and down the sweeping staircase, his footsteps ringing hollow against the imported marble floors. He wandered into the grand kitchen and stared at the empty spot where Serena always sat. He looked at the patch of floor where just days before he'd stood arrogantly lecturing contractors about gutting walls to build a home theater. The sheer absurdity of that confidence turned his stomach. He moved into the living room and dropped onto the custom Italian leather sofa. He buried his face in his hands. Reality crashed over him in relentless, suffocating waves. He wasn't a man navigating a rough divorce or a temporary financial setback. He was a cornered criminal. The federal lending institution was actively reviewing his fraudulent application. Automated systems were already flagging his home network IP address. He knew with cold certainty that federal investigators were assembling a felony identity theft and wire fraud case with his name on it. He saw the image clearly, police cruisers rolling into the manicured driveway, lights strobing. He saw himself being walked out in handcuffs past every wealthy neighbor he'd spent years performing for. He saw a federal prison cell, the bars, the gray light, the silence of a different kind. Panic closed as around his throat like a fist, making it hard to draw breath. He needed a lawyer immediately, but every credit card was dead. He needed cash, but the joint account had been emptied to zero. He scrolled desperately through his phone contacts, searching for anyone who might throw him a line. He scanned the names his prestigious country club crowd, the executives he'd shared fairways with, the men he'd bought expensive rounds for at the clubhouse bar. He knew without dialing a single number that not one of them would lend him a cent. They were sharks who only swam with other successful men. If he called and admitted he was broke, facing eviction, and under federal investigation, there would be no sympathy. They'd hang up and turn his collapse into country club gossip before dinner was served. There was only one person on earth with the resources, the reach, and the influence to slow the avalanche bearing down on him. Only one man had ever pulled him back from the edge of his own self-made disasters. Brennan stared at my name glowing on his phone screen. The humiliation of what he was about to do rose in his throat like bile. Less than a week ago, he had stood over me at a formal dinner party and spat in my face. He had called me a useless freeloader. Now he had to crawl back to the very man he'd degraded and beg for his survival. His thumb trembled as he pressed the call button. He held the phone to his ear and listened to the long, steady rings. He prayed I'd pick up, that I'd hear the desperation and slip back into the soft, forgiving father I'd played for 36 years. The call dropped straight to my voicemail. Brennan shut his eyes and let out a ragged, shaking breath. When the beep sounded, he tried to speak, but his voice gave out entirely. The booming, arrogant tone of the self-proclaimed millionaire was gone without a trace. When the words finally came, he sounded like a terrified little boy, lost somewhere in the dark. He opened with a stuttering, pitiful apology about the dinner party, blaming the stress of his hidden debts for the way he'd snapped. But the mask didn't hold long. The raw terror of federal prosecution shattered him completely. He broke down, sobbing into the receiver, loud and uncontrolled, and ended by begging me to call him back. He confessed to a catastrophic error on a loan application. He wept that Serena had walked out on him, that he had no money even for food, that he was staring down the loss of everything. He pleaded for a face-to-face, a chance to look me in the eye and put the pieces back together. The voicemail ended with a grown man begging his father to please just come home and save him. Far away out on the wide balcony of my penthouse condo on Sea Island, Georgia, I let the whole thing play out on speaker. The Atlantic Ocean rolled in with its steady, indifferent rhythm beneath my son's total psychological collapse. I heard the heaving sobs, the frantic promises to be different, the desperate reaching for a lifeline. Not one ounce of pity moved through me, not the old familiar pull to rush in and absorb his consequences the way a father does. I received his breakdown the way a corporate liquidator takes stock of a failed asset, clinically without sentiment. He wasn't crying out of any genuine remorse for the contempt he'd shown me. The tears had nothing to do with understanding how badly he'd wounded the man who built his entire world for him. Every sob was for himself alone. He had finally burned through every resource and every person willing to carry him, and now the federal government was tightening its grip. His love for me had only ever been love for what I could provide. With the vault permanently sealed, his apologies didn't register as currency. I picked up the phone. I did not press callback. I wasn't about to hand him a live conversation he could use to work my emotions. I opened a new text instead. No greeting, no comfort, no assurance that things would work out. Just a single date, a specific time, and the exact street address of Grant Holloway's high-security law office in the Midtown Atlanta financial corridor. I hit send and set the phone back on the glass table. In the hollow, echoing hallway of the sprawling suburban estate in Alpharetta, Georgia, Brennan heard the chime. He grabbed the phone, dragging the back of his hand across his bloodshot eyes, hoping for forgiveness. What he found on the screen was a sterile corporate summons. No warmth, no reassurance, no fatherly softness at all. Just a cold formal order, pointing him straight into the jaws of the trap. He stared at the address of the most ruthless litigation firm in the city and understood immediately what it meant. This was not a family reconciliation. He was walking into a legal execution, and he had no choice but to show up. The conference room on the 38th floor had been designed as an instrument of psychological pressure, a massive gleaming walnut dining table, floor-to-ceiling glass windows framing the whole sprawl of the city below, a silence dense enough to feel physical. I sat at the head of it in a tailored navy suit I hadn't worn since the days I ran executive boardrooms. Grant Holloway occupied the chair to my right, an open leather portfolio laid out before him. We didn't exchange a word. We simply waited for a broken man to arrive. When the heavy glass door finally opened, the figure who entered bore almost no resemblance to the person I knew. Just a week earlier, Brennan had been the arrogant master of his sprawling Alpharetta property chest, outdressed in designer tailoring, every inch the lord of his domain. What shuffled into that conference room looked like it had aged a decade in under a week. He had on the same dress shirt from the day he'd been thrown out of the real estate law firm, now badly wrinkled in the dark with sweat stains. He hadn't touched a razor. His eyes were completely bloodshot purple hollows sagging beneath them. He had the look of something cornered with nowhere left to go. Brennan didn't sit. He paced the length of the Persian rug hands, moving in frantic circles, launching into a hysterical, unhinged monologue. His first move was to grab the victim's chair, demanding to know how his own flesh and blood could be so unspeakably cruel. He cried that Serena had packed everything and walked out, leaving him alone in a dark house with the power cut off by the utility companies. He shouted that he had no money for food, no gas for his car. Then he flung his hands up and delivered the exact line I'd been waiting for. He turned to me, with tears running down his face, and wanted to know why I was burning down his entire life over a few drops of spilled wine. He called it a moment of stress, a brief lapse in judgment, and painted my response as the unhinged overreaction of a bitter old man. He begged me to call Pinnacle Asset Group, move a few thousand into his account, so he could win Serena back and put an end to what he called a ridiculous temper tantrum. I let him go until his voice gave out and his breath ran dry. I didn't interrupt. I didn't raise my voice. When the silence of that high-altitude room settled back over us, I placed both hands flat on the cool surface of the table. I looked straight into his ruined eyes and let the last trace of the quiet, naive grandfather fall away entirely. I spoke to him the way a senior executive speaks to a fraudulent employee measured cold, without a single wasted word. I told him this had nothing whatsoever to do with a spilled glass of wine. The wine was simply the moment I recognized that my massive years-long investment in his life had yielded nothing of value. I told him to sit down, not a request, a command carrying every ounce of the authority I had taken back. Brennan dropped into a leather chair across the table. The bluster drained out of him instantly. I reached over and drew the leather portfolio away from Grant Holloway. I opened it and lifted out the first piece of evidence. I slid a heavy watermarked document across the table until it came to rest directly in front of Brennan's shaking hands. I told him to look at it. It was the certified deed to the $1.2 million estate. I pointed out the name of the holding company and my signature on the original cash purchase agreement. I told him I'd restructured ownership of that house 3 years ago to pull him back from the edge of bankruptcy. But his ego had apparently convinced him he'd earned it himself. I reminded him I'd handed him $30,000 in cash to cover the property taxes, and he'd pocketed every dollar. I made clear that the eviction wasn't revenge. It was a standard corporate response to a delinquent, fraudulent tenant. Before he could get a single excuse out, I pulled a thick-bound spreadsheet from the folder and dropped it on the table. The impact made him flinch. I told him that document was a line-by-line accounting of $150,000 in credit card payments I had quietly covered over the last 3 years. The expensive dinners, the country club, dues, the luxury car payments I'd been subsidizing the entire time he treated me like an unwanted stray dog in the attached suite. I told him he had never been a successful businessman. He was a dependent child playing dress-up on his father's money. Brennan started to open his mouth, an apology, a plea something, but I cut him off. A third stack of papers went across the table, high-resolution bank records and scanned checks from his late mother's memorial charity fund. Every drop of color left his face. He looked like a man already dead. I watched his eyes move across his own clumsy forged signatures. I told him that stealing from me was an insult to my intelligence, but stealing from the legacy of the woman who brought him into this world was an unforgivable sin, one that had permanently and irrevocably severed whatever remained between us as father and son. He broke down completely, face buried in both hands, head shaking in raw shame. He sobbed that he'd only been trying to hold his marriage together, that the financial pressure had pushed him past the edge. But I wasn't done. The final piece was still inside the leather portfolio. I reached in one last time and drew out a single freshly printed sheet. I pushed it across the table, slow, deliberate, no rush at all. It was the digital confirmation of the $50,000 personal loan application, bearing my full legal name, my social security number, his home network IP address, and his forged electronic signature. Brennan stared at the paper the way a man stares at a loaded gun pointed between his eyes. His breathing stopped cold. The tears evaporated on the spot, swallowed by a suffocating bone-deep terror. I leaned in, elbows on the table, and dropped my voice to a whisper that cut through the silence like a blade. I told him the bank had automatically flagged that application as felony identity theft and wire fraud. I told him that federal regulators were already tracing the digital trail he had left behind so carelessly. It landed on him in that exact agonizing instant. I wasn't simply evicting him from his borrowed mansion. I had assembled the undeniable documented proof of his total financial and moral unraveling, and what he was staring at was decades inside a federal prison. Brennan's eyes stayed locked on that printed evidence of his felony loan application. His breathing went shallow and fast as the full weight of that reality came down and crushed the last brittle fragments of his arrogance. He lifted his gaze from the paper and stared across the gleaming walnut dining table. He was scanning my face in desperation, hunting for the soft, forgiving father he had worked for 36 years. He wanted a flicker of pity, some familiar signal that I would reach out and pull him back from the edge. He found nothing. My face was a wall of cold, impenetrable stone. I returned his stare with the quiet detachment of a man who had already buried his son in his heart. The silence inside that high-altitude law office stretched out for several agonizing minutes. Brennan opened his mouth, but panic had closed his throat. He pressed his trembling hands against his face, trying to wipe away the tears and cold sweat. When I finally spoke, my voice never climbed above a calm, even volume, but every word struck him like something physical. I told him that his entire life I had been the invisible shield standing between him and consequence. I had paid for his disasters and absorbed the shock of every failure he produced. I had quietly purchased a massive estate so he could perform the role of self-made success in front of a woman who valued him only for his money. I told him I would have been content to spend whatever days I had left in that small, attached suite just to be close to him, but he couldn't leave well enough alone. His ego was too swollen for silent charity. It demanded that he degrade me instead. I reminded him of that dinner party. I reminded him of how he stood over me and spat directly into my face in front of his wealthy in-laws. He flinched hard at that. He began to sob again, pleading with me to understand that hidden consumer debt had pushed him to the breaking point. He insisted the pressure had briefly stripped him of his senses. I shifted forward slightly, my hands resting on the cool surface of the conference table. Then I delivered the blow that mattered most. I told him he had spat on the only hand that was feeding him. I told him he had convinced himself he was a king in a grand castle, when in truth he was nothing but a beggar living off an allowance. I held his bloodshot gaze and told him I was not destroying his life. I was simply making him pay for it. Brennan choked on a sob and buried his face in his hands. He cried that he had nothing, not a single thing left. He cried that Serena had emptied their checking account and walked out on him. He begged me to tell the bank the loan application was a family mix-up. He begged me to shield him from the federal investigators. I sat without moving and let him fall apart. When the frantic sobbing finally died down to a miserable whimper, I gave a small nod to my attorney. Grant Holloway slid a thick, legally binding contract across the table, followed by a heavy silver pen. The packet of papers came to rest directly in front of Brennan. I told him he had gotten one thing exactly right. I was the only person alive who could keep him out of a federal penitentiary. I told him I was prepared to neutralize the fraud alert and inform the authorities that I would not pursue charges for the identity theft or the stolen memorial funds. But it wouldn't be out of love. It would be a business transaction, nothing more. I laid out the terms of his surrender. The document in front of him was an ironclad, non-negotiable legal agreement. If he signed it, he was voluntarily and permanently forfeiting any and all future claims to my estate. He was agreeing to be legally disinherited. He would never receive another penny from me while I was alive, and he would receive absolutely nothing when I was gone. Brennan stared at that thick stack of papers. He was being asked to willingly sign away millions of dollars in future inheritance. But I wasn't done. The second condition was an accelerated eviction. He had exactly 24 hours to return to the estate and collect his personal clothing. No furniture, no appliances, no fixtures, none of it. If he was still on the property when those 24 hours ran out, the corporate agents from Pinnacle Asset Group would change the locks and have him taken away for trespassing. Then I delivered the third and final condition: a lifetime, no-contact order. Once he walked out through the heavy glass doors of this office, he was never to call me, text me, or come near me again. He was to treat me as legally dead. He was being cut away from my existence completely and permanently. I gave him the choice plainly. He could pick up the heavy silver pen and sign the surrender document buying his freedom from federal prison, but guaranteeing a life of absolute poverty. Or he could refuse, and I would walk out that door immediately. And if I walked out, I promised I would hand the full forensic audit of the stolen memorial funds directly to the police and cooperate without reservation with the federal investigators on the identity theft. Brennan looked at the heavy silver pen. His hands shook violently. He raised his eyes to me one final time, with a pathetic broken plea for another chance. He begged me to remember the fishing trips when he was a small boy. He begged me to remember how much his late mother had loved him. I didn't blink. I didn't soften. I simply looked at him and waited. He turned to Grant Holloway, who was watching him with the cold, flat eyes of a shark scenting blood in the water. Brennan understood he had no leverage left whatsoever. He was trapped inside a nightmare entirely of his own making. The vision of an unyielding federal prison cell overrode whatever pride still clung to him. His trembling fingers reached out and closed around the heavy silver pen. He bent over the gleaming walnut dining table and began to sign. The scratching drag of the pen across the thick paper rang out in the silent room. Page after page he signed, initialing every clause that stripped away his inheritance and his family. His tears fell without restraint, leaving small, damp stains across the legal documents. He was signing away his safety net, his future, and his father. When he reached the final page and scrawled his signature for the last time, the pen slipped from his fingers and clattered against the wood. He sagged back into the chair, a completely hollowed-out shell. Grant Holloway reached across the table and gathered the signed documents without ceremony, securing them inside his leather portfolio. The transaction was complete. I rose from my chair and slowly buttoned my tailored navy suit jacket. I looked down at the weeping wreck of a man still seated at the table. There was no anger in me, no sorrow either. What I felt was an immense, overwhelming sense of closure. I told him the meeting was finished. I told him his 24-hour countdown had officially begun. I turned my back on my former son and walked out of that conference room, leaving him to face the cold, unforgiving weight of a life he would finally have to pay for on his own. The 24 hours I gave him expired with absolute precision. If you were to drive out today toward the bleak industrial fringe of the city, far from the manicured lawns and sweeping driveways of the affluent suburbs, you would find a rundown structure of aged brick near the Norfolk Southern rail yards in southwest Atlanta. It sits hard against a constantly active train track. Up on the third floor at the far end of a dimly lit hallway that permanently smells of boiled cabbage and stale cigarette smoke sits a cramped studio apartment. This is my son's new castle. The custom Italian leather sofas and the imported marble countertops are long gone. What replaced them is a stained secondhand mattress sitting directly on a warped linoleum floor. The only view he has is a brick alleyway choked with overflowing dumpsters. Brennan no longer wears expensive tailored suits or waves shiny platinum credit cards around to impress wealthy friends at exclusive country clubs. The counterfeit executive lifestyle evaporated, replaced by the grinding, unforgiving reality of low-wage work. His credit was completely annihilated. His professional standing shredded the moment his former employer caught wind of his sudden financial collapse. With nowhere else to turn, he grabbed whatever employment he could just to keep himself fed. 2 punishing jobs now define his existence. From the pre-dawn hours through the mid-afternoon, he stands behind the counter of a grimy auto parts store, wearing a faded nylon work shirt, absorbing the hostility of short-tempered mechanics who treat him like furniture. When that first shift ends, there is no rest waiting for him. He climbs into a beat-up, rusted used car and hauls himself across town for a night shift, cleaning commercial office buildings, emptying wastebaskets, and scrubbing floors until his hands split and bleed. Sometimes he cleans the very same towering corporate buildings where he once strutted around fancying himself a master of the universe. He steers his janitorial cart past the heavy glass doors of firms in the Midtown Atlanta financial corridor, eyes down, terrified that someone from his former life might look up and recognize the hollow, defeated man mopping their floors. He trudges back to that rusted car through freezing rain because the broken dashboard heater is a luxury repair he simply cannot afford. As icy water seeps through his thin jacket, he is forced to relive the night he proudly threw his 72-year-old father out into a brutal storm over a spilled glass of wine. The poetic justice is total and merciless. He is caught in a relentless, suffocating poverty loop with no exit in sight. Every dollar wrung from his exhausting physical labor vanishes instantly into the towering mountain of consumer debt he piled up while playing dress-up with my money. 80 hours a week of work buys him nothing more than the bare minimum payments on maxed-out credit cards and defaulted luxury car leases. He is not constructing a future. He is simply settling the bill for a fraudulent past. The interest rates are so punishingly steep that no matter how many hours he scrubs those floors, the principal balances hardly budge. He is effectively a financial prisoner, chained to the arrogant miscalculations of a man who genuinely believed he was untouchable. And to make it all immeasurably worse, he is facing every bit of this alone. Serena never looked back after she wheeled her designer luggage out the front door of the house. She immediately retained a ruthless divorce attorney, likely bankrolled by whatever cash she had managed to drain from their accounts, or by going cap in hand to her pretentious parents. The divorce proceedings were swift and showed him no quarter. Because Brennan held primary responsibility on most of their shared debts, the court placed the full weight of the marriage's financial wreckage squarely on his shoulders. But Serena landed one final devastating blow before she disappeared from his life entirely. She successfully petitioned the court to saddle Brennan with exactly half of her exorbitant legal fees. Each month, a significant portion of his meager earnings is automatically garnished to pay the aggressive attorney who legally dismantled his marriage. He is literally writing checks to the woman who walked out the instant the money ran dry. There is no one left to point the finger at. He cannot blame the justice system, and he certainly cannot blame me. Every night when he collapses onto his cheap mattress and lies there, listening to the deafening roar of freight trains rattling his thin windows, he has no choice but to stare down the undeniable truth. He built his own cage and pitched away the key, all because he needed to look important in front of people who never gave a damn about him. The warm morning sun feels entirely different when you are no longer crouching in the shadow of someone else's arrogance. I am standing on the wide balcony of my penthouse condo on Sea Island, Georgia, gazing out over the endless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The clean, salt-laced air fills my lungs. I draw one long, slow breath, and for the first time in over 30 years, I feel absolutely weightless. I am vibrant and healthy. The faint tremor in my hands that used to plague me through those tense dinners has vanished entirely. My doctor told me recently that my blood pressure is perfect and that the chronic physical stress I had been carrying for years has fully dissolved. I no longer shuffle quietly through the hallways of a massive house where I was treated like an unwanted ghost. I move with my shoulders back and my head lifted high. My mornings are spent walking the shoreline, the wet sand cool beneath my feet. My afternoons belong to golf and the company of genuine friends who have no interest in the balance of my accounts. My evenings I give to quiet books, the rhythm of crashing waves, and a clean, purposeful life I built entirely with my own hands. When I look back at the decades I spent trying to shape Brennan into a respectable man, I do not find anger anymore. What I find is a profound, unshakable clarity. Society trains us to believe that family is an unbreakable bond, that as parents we must absorb every insult, every betrayal, every heartbreak simply because we share the same blood. We are conditioned to sacrifice our own happiness on the altar of unconditional love. We are told that giving our children everything is the truest measure of our worth. But I have learned the hardest and most valuable lesson of my entire life. Holding on to a toxic family member out of blind obligation is not an act of love. It is a self-imposed prison. By perpetually shielding my son from the consequences of his own behavior, I was not nurturing his growth into a capable adult. I was actively participating in my own destruction. I was permitting a grown man to strip away my dignity simply because I was terrified of facing my final years alone. I purchased him a mansion to patch his insecurities, and what he offered in return was a state-run facility and a face full of spit. People look at my life now and assume that my wealth flows from the millions sitting in my holding accounts. They think wealth is spelled out in a luxury condo, expensive coffee, or the freedom to buy without checking the price. But they are entirely wrong. I had all of that money when I was living in the cramped detached suite, and I was utterly miserable. True wealth has absolutely nothing to do with money. True wealth is the unwavering power to look disrespect directly in the eye and walk away without a single ounce of regret. It is the freedom to guard your own peace of mind above everything else. It is the extraordinary liberating recognition that you do not owe your suffering to anyone, regardless of what last name they share with you. True wealth is drawing a boundary so firm that no degree of emotional manipulation can ever breach it. I lost a son who never truly loved me, but I gained something worth infinitely more. I gained myself. I reclaimed my dignity, my quiet mornings, and my absolute unshakable freedom. The sprawling suburban estate in Alpharetta, Georgia is sold to strangers. The corporate holding companies are secure. The toxic illusion of the perfect family is dead and buried for good. Standing here watching the tide roll in and erase the footprints from the sand, I know with complete certainty that I did the right thing. I survived the deceit. I executed the correction. And now I have finally given myself permission to live out the rest of my days entirely for me. That is a victory no amount of stolen money could ever purchase. And that is where I choose to leave it. Not in the courtroom, not in the wreckage of Brennan's dismantled life, but here, standing on that balcony, breathing clean air, finally free. I spent decades pouring everything I had into a man who saw generosity as weakness. It cost me years of quiet suffering, a dignity I had to reclaim, piece by piece, and a grief that does not have a clean name. But I believe God does not waste a person's pain. The clarity that came out of that long season of loss taught me more about self-worth than any success ever did. Walking away from someone who only ever took that was not failure. That was the most courageous thing I ever did. If this story leaves you with anything, let it be these truths. Providing for someone is not the same as being loved by them. Know the difference before it costs you everything. If a family member only appears when there is something to gain, that is not a relationship worth protecting at any price. Document everything. The paper trail you build in quiet moments will speak louder than any argument when the time comes. And if you ever find yourself in the shadow of someone else's arrogance, remember you are allowed to step into the light, no matter whose last name you share. If this story moved you, I would genuinely love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Share it with someone who might need to hear it today. A friend who is struggling, someone who has been told their feelings do not matter. They deserve to know they are not alone. And if you have not already subscribed to Honor Revenge Stories, so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take good care of yourself. Until next time.